Have you ever felt an almost unbearable urge to simply switch off part of your memory? To erase a lived experience, get rid of burning shame, silence the rage, or cut out the dull, grinding pain of a loss that keeps you from functioning normally. We do this far more often than we are willing to admit. We try to ignore whatever triggers us. We lock away our wrong desires. We tell ourselves that the person we were in moments of weakness or anger no longer exists. The logic feels airtight. If I don't think about it, it isn't there. If I've pushed it into the furthest corner of my inner basement, I'm safe. But what if that basement is not a graveyard of dead memories? What if it's a fully functioning space where the parts of yourself you've locked away continue to exist and continue to shape your life? In 2022, Severence took this idea to its terrifying logical extreme. Its characters have a chip implanted in their brains that literally splits their consciousness. One part of the personality lives in the external world, while the other is locked on the work floor with no access to personal life. It is a precise metaphor for what analytical psychology calls the shadow. Today, we begin a larger series on how the suppressed parts of our psyche actually work. We are starting with Severance because it lets us see, with uncomfortable clarity, what price we pay when we decide we can simply cut away the parts of ourselves we don't like. In Severance, the chip in the skull is the endpoint, the last resort of an adult who has run out of other options. In real life, the foundation of our inner basement is laid much earlier. Roughly around the age of 3. This is when a child begins to separate their sense of self from their mother and starts testing the world's resistance. This is also when the sorting begins. Parents and the surrounding environment start establishing rules about what in you is good and what is unacceptable. If you get angry, you're bad. If you throw a tantrum, you're difficult. If you're cunning, you're a liar. To preserve attachment and receive the approval of the adults who matter, the child begins hiding parts of themselves. A simple but rigid logic forms. This part of me is allowed, this part is not. Everything that is consistently rejected by the environment does not disappear. It gets suppressed, pushed down into that basement. This layer of the repressed is what Jungian psychology calls the shadow. The colder, more narcissistic, or psychologically immature the parents, the more severe this split tends to be. Adults who cannot manage their own suppressed impulses are more likely to stamp out those same impulses in their children. However, this process is rarely total. More often, suppression is selective. One domain is tightly controlled behavior or achievement, while another is left unattended. In those blind spots, repressed energy finds ways to express itself indirectly. One child becomes the perfect student but shows cruelty to peers. Another grows up quiet and compliant, but channels their suppressed force into rebellion or creative work. It is important to understand, the suppressed parts of the psyche do not remain static. The psyche is a system in which energy redistributes. What has been pushed down does not evaporate. It continues to influence behavior, seeping back into life through consistent channels. The most common of these is our closest relationships, where the repressed acts as a mirror. Two scenarios tend to play out. Either we are unconsciously drawn to people who openly express the qualities we have forbidden in ourselves. Or we encounter those qualities through projection. It seems to us that it is not we who feel the envy, the aggression, the greed, it is the people around us. We attribute our own impulses to others, and then judge them for it. Sexuality is another powerful channel. In analytical psychology, libido is understood more broadly than simple sexual drive. It refers to psychic energy as a whole. When embodiment and desire are placed under taboo, sexuality can become one of the primary containers for repressed energy. Aggression, the drive for control, impulsivity. This often leads to a split self-image and a double life, where private behavior diverges sharply from the social persona. Under more total suppression, a different pattern emerges. The energy itself becomes inaccessible, desires weaken, and the connection to physical sensation and attraction grows blurred. Repressed material can also disguise itself in socially approved forms, channeled into work and achievement, where it surfaces as exhausting perfectionism and workaholism. When a child was never given the right to fail, or was only valued for results, a dependency on external validation forms, a way of stabilizing one's inner state through the constant production of achievements. When psychological avenues for expression are systematically blocked, the pressure begins to migrate into the body. Suppressed emotions manifest as chronic tension, anxiety, and psychosomatic symptoms. The body takes on the function of expressing what was never allowed to become conscious. Creative work can become a more adaptive channel, where internal conflicts find symbolic form. Through writing, music, or visual art, what has been suppressed can be expressed without direct destruction, gradually becoming available to awareness. This is how we arrive at adult life fragmented, drawing on only a fraction of our potential. Where suppression was selective, the repressed may erupt in specific domains, around power or intimacy. Where suppression was more total, a different extreme emerges: reduced initiative, diffused desires, and a pervasive sense of emptiness. The psyche keeps searching for release, but finds it through increasingly indirect routes: apathy, avoidance, and various forms of dependency. Imagine two bags you are carrying across the desert of your life. In the first, your persona, socially approved qualities, professionalism, kindness, and the performance of correctness. In the second, which you drag along behind you while trying not to open it, the suppressed parts, aggression, fear, envy. Desires and impulses that found no place in your proper version of yourself. In your 20s, this strategy is still sustainable. There is plenty of natural energy, and attention is focused on building a life, career, relationships, status. By your 30s, ignoring the second bag becomes harder. It starts to pull you back noticeably. But in your 40s, a crisis often arrives. The resources that persona alone could provide are exhausted, and moving forward while operating solely on should and external expectations becomes steadily more difficult. The desert grows hotter, and the first bag is running empty. Severence takes the attempt to run from yourself to its absolute limit. The main character, Mark, does not undergo the procedure for happiness. He is trying to reduce the intensity of the pain from his wife's death. His calculation: if he can segment off the part of himself that will operate mechanically, his external life will become easier. The result is the opposite. His outer self still suffers, remains locked in loss, and his life is stripped of texture and meaning. His inner version, his innie, simply follows instructions for a long time without asking any questions. It is worth being precise. Lumen does not separate shadow from persona. They split the psyche itself into isolated segments. But it is precisely within this artificial isolation that we can see how suppressed and unintegrated aspects begin to make themselves known, through glitches, through anxiety, and through gradual internal conflict. This maps directly onto ordinary life. We often operate in very similar ways, trying to isolate painful experience, switch off unwanted reactions, remove anger or vulnerability from ourselves, expecting that things will then be simpler. But along with what seems excess, we inevitably lose access to energy. Without contact with the repressed parts, a person in their 40s may find themselves at an impasse. No drive for growth, no clear desires, a diminishing sense of meaning. A significant portion of psychic energy remains locked in the second bag, with no way to reach it. We become fragmented versions of ourselves who function, but do not develop. A similar dynamic frequently shows up in professional life. Who is more likely to keep moving forward over the long term? The person who tries to remain purely correct, avoids conflict, and suppresses any hardness in themselves, or the one who can acknowledge and work with a broader range of their own qualities, including ambition, drive, and strategic thinking. This is not an argument for destructive behavior. It is an observation that access to a wider range of your own energy simply gives you more options. Splitting the psyche does not solve the deficit. It deepens it. On the surface, Dylan looks like the most well-adjusted employee in the department. He is alive, direct, and completely uninhibited. Unlike Mark, he does not seem fragmented or suppressed. Dylan speaks openly about what he wants, flirts, takes visible pride in his achievements, and enjoys displaying them. Inside Lumen's system, he thrives. He has status, a mountain of corporate awards and clear rules he consistently wins by. Looked at superficially, it might seem like Dylan has no shadow problem. He does not strain to be correct at any cost, and he is unbothered by moralizing. The energy is there, and it expresses itself freely. But this is precisely where an important psychological shift becomes visible. Dylan's problem is not the suppression of the shadow. It is the localization of it. All of his energy is sealed inside the sterile perimeter of the office. His ambition and drive are pointed at symbolic prizes, corporate bonuses like waffle parties, which generate a feeling of significance without providing any real experience of life. This is energy removed from context and plugged into someone else's coordinate system. It is not suppressed, but it does not fully belong to him either. The break comes when he collides with a reality outside the office. The scene in which Dylan learns about the existence of his son changes everything. For the first time, he encounters something that cannot be substituted, an experience that does not fit the old coordinate system, and precisely because of that, dismantles it. From that moment, the old incentives stop working. You cannot motivate Dylan with an Employee of the Month award any longer, because his energy has found a different vector. The system registers this immediately and does what it does best. It tries to absorb this new source of meaning into its control mechanism to restore the balance of power. Dylan is an important example for this discussion. He shows us that the problem is not always suppression or the freezing of the shadow. Sometimes the repressed energy is accessible, active, and providing momentum, but it is not embedded in a coherent life structure. It exists separately, as a resource for executing assigned roles rather than as part of a conscious choice. His story captures that gap precisely, between having the energy and having no genuine direction for it, because energy alone is genuinely not enough. Even with access to your own force, without a connection to real, subjectively meaningful experience, you risk being maximally efficient inside someone else's system. Irving is Dylan's complete opposite. Where Dylan is energy directed outward, Irving is structure taken to its limit. He is restrained, disciplined, and profoundly loyal to the system. Inside Lumen, he presents as the ideal carrier of the persona. Corporate ideology is not merely a set of instructions for him. It is close to a closed belief system. He does not argue, does not doubt, and looks like a model of healthy adaptation. But this degree of orderliness rarely arises on its own. Behind it lies powerful suppression. This is not the absence of impulses. It is the necessity of continuously holding them back. And in Irving, the system of containment begins to break down. First, the repressed breaks through in symbols and intrusive imagery. The black paint that appears in his perceptions has no explanation within the logic of the office. This is the intrusion of material that was never made conscious. What cannot be expressed directly begins to manifest in imagistic, almost physically felt form. But the real trigger is not a symptom. It is a feeling. The relationship with Bert is the point where Irving's rigid structure begins to crack. For the first time, an emotional attachment arises that is not prescribed by the rules and cannot be fully brought under control. This is an experience that cannot be fitted back into the old system. When Bert is forcibly removed, something breaks. The previous mechanisms stop holding. The rules can no longer stabilize the internal state. Loss appears, and with it, the necessity of confronting what had previously been kept outside the field of awareness. The next shift comes when Irving encounters the reality of his outer version. He discovers that outside the office, his life is structured differently. His external self is already looking for answers and is no longer in the same state of loyalty to the system. This creates critical tension, because it becomes clear that what he took to be his identity was only part of a construction. The suppressed and unintegrated aspects have long existed and been expressing themselves beyond the boundaries of that ordered version. Irving's story is a vivid illustration of how the shadow can remain invisible for a long time behind a rigid persona. When a person fully identifies with a role, an experience of stability arises. But the price of that stability is constant internal pressure. His path demonstrates, the tighter the control, the more indirect and symbolic the routes through which the repressed will eventually find its way out. First as image, then as feeling, and finally as action that begins to change the entire system. Ignoring this process indefinitely is not possible. Helly breaks the system's general logic from the very beginning. Where others gradually adapt and look for ways to fit in, she flatly refuses to accept the rules and immediately challenges the construction of Severence itself. Her reaction is not simply a difficult personality. It is a fundamentally different way of engaging with what is happening. From her first days, Helly demonstrates something none of the others have, a categorical refusal to become a function. She does not accept the identity on offer, does not agree to play by the rules, and does not attempt to find comfort within them. Any attempt to impose a role on her meets resistance. At the level of behavior, this looks like rebellion, but looked at more deeply, this is less a protest against the system than a refusal to surrender subjecthood. Unlike Dylan, whose energy was absorbed into the system, and Irving, who held onto structure as a stabilizing force for a long time, Helly never consents to either strategy. She has no period of adaptation. There is only escalating tension. Here a key paradox emerges. In external reality, Helly occupies the diametrically opposite position. She is embedded in the system as deeply as possible. Her outer identity is connected to the very structure of power that created this mechanism. The contrast is sharp. The more thoroughly her external version is part of the system, the more radically her inner version refuses to submit to it. This is not coincidence. It is compensation. What cannot be expressed in one part of the psyche surfaces in another, in a more concentrated, direct, and uncontrollable form. Gradually, her behavior escalates, from resisting the rules to open confrontation, and then to the extreme, where what is at stake is no longer status, but the right not to be treated as an object. Helly does not simply want to escape. She refuses to recognize the legitimacy of the situation in which her existence has been reduced to a function. Her actions may look destructive, but they follow a clear internal logic. In the absence of any control over her own life, she refuses to participate in the system at all. This is precisely why she becomes the catalyst for change in everyone around her, dismantling the illusion of normality. Helly is an example of how the shadow can manifest not as hidden energy or as symptom, but as direct action through refusal, and this is simultaneously her greatest strength and her greatest risk. Mark is the central point of the entire construction. Where the other characters each demonstrate a distinct strategy for managing the repressed, his case shows an attempt at a radical solution, not to express, not to control, not to redirect the energy, but to cut it off entirely. He does not come to Lumen out of curiosity or ambition. His decision is a response to loss. His wife's death dismantles the structure on which his life depended, and he simply cannot manage the intensity of what he is going through. Alcohol, disorientation, the loss of all meaning, these point to a psyche that is breaking under the load. It is in this state that he agrees to the severance procedure. It is important to understand that on a psychological level, this is not an attempt to start fresh. It is an attempt to remove the source of pain without living through it. Mark wants to excise the experience itself while preserving his social functioning. On the surface, this appears to work. His innie version is stripped of the traumatic backstory, is stable, manageable, and capable of executing tasks. Unlike the outer Mark, who is hopelessly stuck in loss, the innie does not suffer to the same degree. But something else vanishes along with the pain: coherence, motivation, and the felt sense of why anything is worth doing at all. The outer Mark does not move forward. He does not process the loss. He is effectively preserved inside it, which is why his life becomes flat and static. The inner Mark, by contrast, functions, but his existence is tightly bounded by the system's parameters. He has no past, no context, no understanding of what his actions mean. He acts, but he does not choose. This is the crux. Severance does not solve the problem. It distributes it. Pain stays concentrated in one part of the personality, functionality in another, but neither part is whole. Over time, this fragile construction inevitably breaks down. The innie gradually moves beyond the assigned role. Doubts emerge, curiosity forms, new attachments develop. He begins asking questions, and this movement cannot be explained by the system's internal logic. It is the return of what was forcibly removed. Meanwhile, the outer Mark remains in stagnation until the innie breaks back into his life, because the attempt to avoid the pain has not led to recovery. It has only fixed him in the moment of loss. Mark's story is the extreme version of a strategy many of us use in everyday life. Remove whatever is too painful to carry and keep functioning. But the price of that choice is the loss of wholeness, because it is not possible to selectively switch off only the suffering without touching the life force itself. Sooner or later, what was suppressed begins to come back. Looking at all four characters together, it becomes clear that these are not separate stories. They are four variations on a single attempt to manage internal conflict. Dylan does not suppress his energy. He hands it obediently to the system, allowing it to circulate in a narrow, controlled channel. Irving constructs a rigid structure and an ideal persona to contain what does not fit into his picture of the world. Helly refuses to comply and moves directly into conflict, manifesting the shadow through radical refusal to be reduced to an object. Mark attempts the most radical solution of all, simply cutting the pain away, splitting the very fabric of his psyche. Despite the differences in their strategies, the outcome is always the same, because none of these approaches leads to genuine wholeness. In each case, a part of the psyche is either isolated, suppressed, or placed outside the reach of conscious awareness. We can handle our unwanted qualities in different ways, through control, rebellion, compensation, or avoidance, but the underlying structure of the split remains unchanged. This is precisely why the system in Severance feels so disturbingly recognizable. It is not science fiction. It is a psychological mechanism we use every day, taken to its absolute limit, as we decide which parts of ourselves are allowed to stay and which must be hidden. The fundamental problem is that the psyche does not work like a file deletion system. Everything that is suppressed does not disappear. It continues to exist and to influence us, through psychosomatic symptoms, through projections in our relationships, through sudden and apparently inexplicable emotional eruptions. Sometimes the shadow announces itself simply as a dull, persistent emptiness when everything looks correct on the outside, but the taste for life has been completely lost. The attempt to be rid of your shadow self does not produce liberation. It produces a split, leaving us perfect but hollow, functional but without meaning. If suppression, control, and even radical severance do not solve the problem, the question becomes, what then? That question, taken to its furthest extreme, leads to a very different and far more dangerous strategy, not suppressing the shadow, but surrendering control to it entirely. In the next breakdown, we look at that through Fight Club. If Severance shows us the attempt to run from yourself, Fight Club shows us the attempt to finally become your shadow, which turns out to be an entirely different kind of catastrophe.